And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris.
And my name is Danielle, and this is the State of Freedom. Hey, everybody. We know that we have been a few days late getting to you on the Veto override session. It's taken a lot of homework to really unpack all that happened in that one day. What day was it, Chris? Wednesday?
Tuesday
Tuesday at the Capitol. It was just a day of nonstop action. So we're coming to you after having done a lot of homework, and we will be sharing with you kind of all of our thoughts and insights, some play-by-plays. But before we get into that, let me start us with a scripture. Today's verses are Isaiah chapter 55, verses 10 through 17. And it says, "For the mountains may be removed and the hills may shake, but my loving kindness will not be removed from you, and my covenant of peace will not be shaken, says the Lord who has compassion on you. O afflicted one, storm-tossed and not comforted, behold, I will set your stones in antimony, and your foundations I will lay in sapphires. Moreover, I will make your battlements of rubies and your gates crystal, and your entire wall of precious stones. All of your sons will be taught of the Lord, and the well-being of your sons will be great. In righteousness you will be established. You will be far from oppression, for you will not fear, and from terror, for it will not come near you. If anyone fiercely assails you, it will not be from me. Whoever assails you will fall because of you. Behold, I myself have created the smith who blows the fire of coals and brings out a weapon for its work. And I have created the destroyer to ruin. No weapon that is formed against you will prosper, and every tongue that accuses you in judgment you will condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their vindication is from me, declares the Lord." This is just such an encouragement to me that though the world around us may be in chaos, the Lord's love never leaves us, and we don't have to be shaken. It's a promise, and it's a reminder that the Lord sees us, and he sees what we're going through, and he has made provision to fortify and to protect us. He's made a way for our children to be raised knowing his word and his ways despite the turmoil and the wickedness of the world we're living in. And it's also just a really great reminder that he is far greater than our enemy, Satan. He made Satan. Satan is in no way his equal, and the Lord can take that fallen, degenerate angel out anytime with a single word or with a single instruction to his angels. And the part of the passage that I really want to underscore is that the Lord promises that no weapon of the enemy will prevail against us. And he instructs us right here in verse 17 to rise up and speak boldly against every single accusation that comes against us in judgment. The Lord promises to vindicate us, and we can rest confidently in that promise.
You know, Danielle, it can be very, very difficult in a world of turbulence to accept, on a fundamental level, to accept the idea that God is our safe harbor. In other words, there can be storms swirling everywhere around us, but he is our safe harbor. And people are like, I'm thinking, what do you mean, Lord, that we truly can have perfect peace, even in the midst of incredible turbulence in the world? But that's exactly what he means, that we can have safety, security, and peace amidst a world of turbulence. And that really is the extraordinary power of his grace. That is something that is so far beyond anything that we can do on our own. But it is absolutely 100% true. And no weapon formed against you shall prosper. That is one of my all-time favorite scripture quotes. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. And when you look at this past legislative session, which we're going to be getting into, Danielle, it may appear as though on some of these bills, the adversary prevailed, but because of what we're exposing, because of the information that we have gathered that we're going to provide to citizens across Louisiana, they may have won a few battles here, but guess who's going to win this war? We are.
That is right. We are going to win this war. Speaking of war, Chris, We wanted to start out with something a little different today with some big news on Senator Facey.
Yes, let me give a little background on this. Senator Mike Facey, a very good conservative state senator from down your way, down Homa, Thibodeau area.
Yeah, he's my state senator.
He's your state senator. He stood very strong throughout the legislative session for House Bill 648, which was Representative Gabe Furman's prohibition against this transgender mutilation surgery on minors in the state of Louisiana, that ghastly procedure that really should be non controversial, particularly in a state like ours. He stood strong on it. He stood strong on it when it passed in the original session, and he stood strong on it in the veto override session, uh, and spoke very passionately about the importance of it. Well, Senator Mike Facey had a gift when he got back to his office after the veto override session from a professor at LSU. And I wouldn't have believed this if I had not heard this voicemail myself. But Professor Marcus Venable left Senator Facey, a sociology professor at LSU, he left Senator Facey a very, very nice voicemail that perhaps we can play that voicemail. He left it yesterday, and then we can talk about it a little bit, Danielle. But here is the voicemail message that Marcus Venable, the professor at LSU, left for Senator Facey on his voicemail after the veto override session.
Yes, and just a disclaimer for the listeners, if there are any sensitive ears, please send them out of the room or maybe just skip through it. I think this is about 40 seconds long. We wouldn't typically share anything of this kind of content, but we just think it's so important to understand the level of vitriol and hate that's being directed at people who are willing to stand up and do the right thing. So, with that said, here is the voicemail.
I just wanted to say congratulations to our state senator, Big Mike Facey, and that fat fucking moron voted to make things worse for people who are already suffering. You fat fucking piece of shit. You did not produce any goddamn evidence to support the claims you made about people being harmed by transgender care. Yet we have tons of empirical evidence showing that it's an increased suicide risk when people don't get this care. So you big fat-headed motherfucker, I can't wait to read your name in the fucking obituary. I will make a goddamn martini made from the tears of butthurt conservatives when we put your fucking ass in the ground, you fat fucking useless piece of shit. Fuck you. I hope you have a terrible day. Go fuck yourself.
Wow, that's
Yes, that is
just
the
disgusting.
professor. Yes, Professor Marcus Venable from LSU leaving a voicemail message for Mike Facey. Danielle, is that a death threat to a public official?
Well, he does talk about putting them down in the ground and drinking a martini with the tears of conservatives. So, yeah, it sounds, I don't know why else you would put someone in the ground unless they were dead.
It certainly seems like something that should be taken very seriously here. And on another level, apart from the possible physical jeopardy that Senator Facey could be in, which is primary here. What does this tell you about the state of education, higher education in Louisiana, public education in particular, and throughout the country? Does not make me more inclined to send my sons to college to be indoctrinated by people like this, filled with hate, people who impose their leftist ideology on their students? Because I read a couple of reports from his students. I went online and read them, and he absolutely imposes this ideology and this vitriol on his students. And what is he talking about here? He is this angry because Senator Facey supported legislation to prohibit the genital mutilation and the chemical castration of minors in Louisiana until they turned 18 years old. And this provokes this type of rage and controversy. I guess I shouldn't be stunned by this, but I am stunned by it.
It's so remarkable. This guy, well, first, if you take a look at some of the things that his interests that he studies. It's criminology, it's about sexual predators. I just found the whole thing pretty disturbing. Frankly, I found his picture disturbing. I found what he talks about in his class to be very disturbing. I think he required some pornography to be viewed by his students, like I don't know if it was a book or a documentary or something about pornography. And I just don't understand. I mean, if you want to study the corrupt and degenerate mind, maybe that's what you study. But I really don't understand the purpose of this. I don't understand how we as taxpayers are fronting this man's salary as he makes death threats to honorable people. It boggles the mind, Chris.
It boggles the mind, and it actually is enraging when you think about the possibility that this guy may actually get away with this. Can you imagine if this was a conservative professor on a college campus and he called a liberal woke state representative or state senator in Louisiana and engaged in this kind of diatribe on a voicemail? What kind of outrage do you think?
Or worse yet, tried to pray for them.
Yes, exactly. What kind of outrage do you think we would see from the left? It would be nonstop. The world is falling, and in all likelihood, that professor would be summarily fired.
Absolutely. This is an absolutely upside down reality. You know, it's rules for me and not for thee. I can't stand this. You know, what continues to get punished is what is right and good. And that was the point I was making about the prayer. What continues to get let slide is loudmouth liberals, foul mouthed liberals who make death threats to honorable people who are doing the right thing for children.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what Senator Mike Facey was doing. Danielle, my suggestion is that we issue a call to action to
Yeah,
our listeners on
absolutely.
this, to the State of Freedom listeners and to the LeCag members. What can they do in order to demand accountability for this Professor Marcus Venable, the sociology teacher at LSU?
Well, we know that the president of LSU is William Tate. And if you go to his website, you can find out that his assistant's name is Debbie Richards. I'm sure she's a lovely woman. So I would just suggest that people email his assistant or give her a call and let them know that this is not something that you find acceptable. Let them know that under any other circumstances, if this was anything that a conservative person had done to offend liberal minded people in any way, shape, or form, that professor would be out on their butt. And I'll tell you one other thing. This guy, Marcus Venable, is not a tenured professor. So anyone saying, oh, you can't get over tenure, this guy, there's no way he's a tenured professor. He only graduated. He was a graduate student, I want to say in 2017, 2018. So I say let's demand that they kick him out.
Let's demand they kick him out. If this was a conservative professor, he would already be gone. If it was a conservative teacher, they would have already kicked him out. They would have already run him out of that university on a rail, and you know that would have already occurred by now. And it needs to occur in this situation as well. The phone number, by the way, Danielle, and I know it'll be in the show notes, but the phone number, if I'm not mistaken, for President Tate's office to his assistant is at 225-578-2111.
Yes, that's one of the numbers for his office. The other one is 225-578-7350.
Yes, and also the email for Miss Richards, as you mentioned, D Richards, RICHARDS, at LSU.edu. You know why it's so important, Danielle, that action be taken here? Because you know that if nothing is done here that is meaningful, all it's going to do is embolden this type of action even more. So nothing's done here. So the next time something like this occurs, maybe this lunatic is actually going over to a state representative or state senator's home. Maybe he's terrorizing their family or doxing them on social media. Maybe they're doing all kind of things. You realize that there were leftists that actually camped out at the homes of U.S. Supreme Court justices 2 or 3 years ago to protest the overriding of Roe versus Wade, the abortion decision. So you know this occurs, you know they're capable of it. That's why it's very important that real action be taken here, because a precedent is going to be set one way or the other here. Either the precedent is going to be this behavior is out of bounds, it's intolerable, and there will be accountability, or it's okay for you to do this and there is no accountability, and then the precedent is that, okay, well, the next time it could be even worse. And I'm not convinced even at this moment that Senator Facey is not in some kind of danger. If someone had made this call to my home or to my office when I had made a vote in the legislature with that type of vitriol, I can tell you right now, I'd be concerned for my family and myself.
Yes. And I just want to also underscore, Chris, the scripture from this morning. It says, "And every tongue that accuses you in judgment, you will condemn." If that was not an accusation in judgment in that voicemail, I couldn't find one on planet Earth. So
Yes.
what I'm saying is, it is very scriptural for us to rise up and say, we will not tolerate this kind of behavior. These kinds of death threats deserve consequences.
Absolutely. And I know that our listeners and our LeCag members are going to take action and they're going to make their voices heard. And we are going to follow this story until this teacher is terminated, until real accountability is visited upon him. I am so tired of watching a double standard, as you talked about earlier, where if you're on the left and if you are engaged in activities and ideas that of the vast majority of Americans disagree with and find repulsive, you can do whatever you want to do with impunity. But if you happen to be a conservative and you jaywalk across the street, then they prosecute you, they indict you, and they retaliate against you, and they try to make your lives absolutely miserable. Well, this situation right here cannot be an example of that type of double standard. Not here, not in Louisiana, not in this situation. Cannot happen.
I agree. And we will hopefully have Senator Facey back on this show soon to give his perspective and just to hear directly from him on the actions he's taken and get an update on the situation.
Yes, and we wanted to bring that to our listeners' attention early on. Let you know we're going to be on top of that because that is getting a lot of traction, as well it should, on social media and nationally. I know there's been some national articles on it because it's a very significant story and it's a very big deal to us. But another very big deal, huge implications for citizens across Louisiana is the legislative session just passed, Danielle.
Yes, Chris, this was a historic veto override session. And before we really get into that, maybe we can just take a minute and you can tell us, what does it take to override the governor's vetoes in terms of votes? What does it take generally, and then specifically this session based on our numbers? What does that look like?
Yes, we have in the House, Danielle, 71 Republicans. In order to override a governor's veto, it requires 2/3, which is 70, one less of the total number of Republicans in the legislature. In the Senate, there are a total of 39 senators. 2/3 of that is 26, and we have 27 senators. So we have more than enough Republicans in the Senate and in the House to overturn any governor's veto. All the Republicans have to do is show up and do their jobs. That is it.
Period. Period. Yet they did not. Yet they did not. So, just to start out with the House, there were two glaring absences from the veto override session, people whose names you have heard before on this show.
Too glaring. Yes, go ahead.
One is Joe Stagney, and the other is Paula Davis. Both were missing in action for the entirety of the session, I will say that we have not heard, at least I have not heard, any excuse or reasoning from Joe Stagney. Paula Davis, there's some questions. There was a purported surgery that one of her children was having, but there's some conflicting news on that, which we'll keep you posted on.
Yes, I'm not convinced in either case, quite frankly. And, we've been put in a position, Danielle, to where we do not trust our public officials anymore. And for very good reason. Under normal circumstances, I'm inclined to always trust when people make representations and always give them the benefit of the doubt because that's the way I want to be treated. But our public officials have betrayed us to such an extent in so many ways that my presumption, unfortunately, is always against them when they make certain representations at this point. So, Representative Stagney and Representative Davis, it is incumbent upon you to come forward and provide credible, documented explanation for why neither one of you showed up for this historic veto override session. I don't know, again, as you said, Danielle, we've heard certain speculations about Representative Davis. I've heard nothing about Representative Stagney. Two Republicans who, if they had been there and registered votes on critical override votes, those votes would have passed the override in the House and gone on to the Senate. But because of their absence, and we'll get into some of these bills, because of their absence, those bills failed in the override vote. So we're not just talking about theoretical considerations here. Their absence cost us a successful override vote in the House of Representatives on multiple bills. And that's exactly why it's important that we get a good explanation for why they were not there.
Yes. And Senator Patrick Connick, there had been a lot of speculation around whether he would be able to attend if there needed to be a second day. He had a supposed trial that he was conducting or participating in. And anyway, his name had been circulating as a question mark in some ways. And he was absent for the initial roll call for the veto override session, which was pretty distressing. And I think it was really disrespectful to the people of the state. I mean, this is a do or die session, right? This is like you're coming here to do the will of the people. You can show up on time. If you can't make it the next day, you can't make it the next day. We'll deal with that as a separate matter. Show up on time for the day that you need to be there. That's how I feel about it. And Chris, also, I think there was one Republican in the Senate who submitted an opt out ballot.
Yeah. Senator Rogers Pope from right out there in Livingston Parish was the only Republican other than Fred Mills to actually vote against having a veto override session. And since there was a veto override session, despite his opposition to it, he did show up. But it's very important for our listeners to know that if Senator Rogers Pope, who has endorsed Representative Buddy Mincy to fill his vacant Senate seat, if he had had his way, we wouldn't have had a veto override session, which means that we would not have been able to override the governor's veto of the minor transgender mutilation bill. That's Senator Rogers Pope. I cannot tell you how distressing that is to know that a retiring Republican state senator would vote against having a veto override session in the state of Louisiana when you consider everything that was at stake in this session. And I think it's important to know that he has endorsed Representative Buddy Mincy. Representative Buddy Mincy is running against Representative Valerie Hodges. We've endorsed
That's
Representative
right.
Hodges, and Representative Hodges is going to be a great senator. I want Representative Buddy Mincy to publicly declare his concern and his disappointment that the state senator who's endorsed him to fill his seat voted against having a veto override session. And I'd like an explanation directly from Senator Rogers Pope. So we'll be on the lookout for that as well. You don't have to face the scrutiny of the voters anymore, Senator Pope, and we understand that. And I have a strong suspicion that if you did have to face the scrutiny of the voters again, there's no way you would have voted against having a veto override session. But since you don't, there's really no political accountability for you, but there's going to be some accountability for Buddy Mincy unless he comes out and expresses his disappointment about that decision on your part.
Yeah, but I bet Senator Pope still wants to live in his district. You know, he's got to go to the grocery store, he's got to get his oil changed. There are things that he needs to be able to do. You'd think he'd want to show face and not be so ashamed and not be so, seen as a disgrace, frankly.
Well, that's true. That is true. At a minimum, the people in his district have every right to know this, because I guarantee you that Senator Rogers Pope is not walking around out there advertising that he opposed a veto override session. I don't know who he had a deal with. I don't know who he made an agreement with. I don't know who he was beholden to or who he owed something to, but it stinks, and it needs to be known publicly what he did. And there were a couple of votes also that we're going to get into, Danielle, on the Senate side during the override session that Senator Pope was very much of a disappointment on as well.
Yeah, he didn't do us very many favors. I'll say that. Now, the House did something really remarkable, Chris, and that was the House did what it was supposed to do, which is a shock to everyone. I mean, it was namely a shock to me. I had to double check to make sure it was true, but the House did vote on every single bill that Governor Edwards vetoed.
We were sitting in the gallery, Danielle, taking meticulous notes. I was right behind you, and I have to tell you, I was pleasantly surprised that the Speaker of the House, Clay Scheck-Snyder, allowed every vetoed bill to be heard on the House floor for an up and down vote. I was very pleased. I was not pleased in most cases with the turnout of that veto override vote, but I was very pleased and very happy that there were recorded votes on every vetoed bill. I'm very gratified by that.
Yes, and I will say that's where the credit to Scheck-Snyder begins and ends. So we have that.
We will leave it at that. This may be the first time in the history of our podcast, Danielle, that we're not sitting here engaged in some sort of legitimate criticism of Clay Scheck-Snyder. But
we'll get there. We'll get to that.
Well, believe me, wait a few minutes. But we will give credit where credit is due.
Yeah, absolutely. We always will. So in the Senate didn't have the intestinal fortitude to override any of the instruments that originated in their chamber. So all they did was vote on whatever the House sent to them, which I frankly think is shameful.
It is shameful. And the three instruments in the Senate, SB 123, SB 159, and SB 196, we did not follow those bills particularly closely. They were not of critical importance to us. But it's worth noting that those bills passed in their House, in their chamber, then in the House, were vetoed by the governor, and they didn't even call those for an override vote. Interesting.
They represent a tremendous amount of work. They represent a tremendous amount of, garnering support and effort to do that. And it leaves me kind of wondering, did they care? Did they care about it? I don't understand this attitude in our legislature of, we'll deal with it next year. Well, was it that important to you in the first place?
Well, Danielle, it's such an interesting point. The whole predicate for my disappointment in the way so much of this went down is that we don't have another year to wait.
Exactly.
We don't have another year. The citizens of Louisiana have been waiting a long, long time for real relief in our state. These senators and representatives had an incredible opportunity to get the ball into the end zone on multiple critical bills, and they failed to do it. They got down to the 10-yard line. After driving down the football field, their faces marred with dust, sweat, and blood. It's 3rd and goal from the 10-yard line. They have a chance to drive it into the end zone. And instead of doing that, they hand the football to the defense and they go whimpering into the showers, into the locker room, having given away the game. That's what happened here way too many times. And, obviously, we're not in any way minimizing the historic significance of 648. We're not even minimizing the historic significance of the fact that there was a veto override session in which, for the first time in history, a governor's veto was overruled. Those are all that's critically important, and we are not minimizing that. But it's difficult not to be somewhat disappointed when it was right there in front of them on so many other bills, and they failed to make simple votes to get the ball into the end zone. And I know we're
Yes.
going to talk about those bills.
Yes. And Chris, just another point on that. I am a person, and you know this about me, and this is probably one of the reasons that we're such good friends. I'm a person of principle, and I'm a person who believes strongly in justice. And so I think it's a huge injustice that these bills were vetoed in the first place, because I think it shows that the governor does not respect the will of the people. And to see that this body, that both chambers had such an opportunity to just stick their thumb in the eye of the governor. Why not do it? Do it. I mean, you believe in the bill, you don't believe in the bill. The bill passed the first time. The bill would have passed if it wasn't for the governor. If it was me, I won't say completely definitively, but the way that I feel about it right now is, if I was showing up for a veto override session where the governor disregarded the will of the people in such a manner, I would be there and I would be voting yes for every single bill.
As a matter of principle, yes, I could not agree with you more. But they blinked. Either they're corrupt, cowardly, or incompetent. One of those three things occurred here on a vast bulk of bills that we'll talk about. And our listeners, quite frankly, are probably not going to be happy. But the great thing about the fact that there were recorded votes in the House on this, that very fact that there are recorded votes that these rhino Republicans cannot run away from now. They are on record having made votes, and that is a good thing.
Absolutely. It's not something they can get away from. And we will not let these mishaps or misvotes or strolls out of the room go unspoken. They're going to be shouted from the rooftops, and I look forward to it, frankly.
Absolutely. So how about let's
Yeah,
go.
let's get into the first bill. House Bill 399 was the first bill that actually was brought up for a vote. And that was, Chris, the vaccine exemption requirement by Kathy Edmonston.
Yes, this is the bill, Danielle, as our listeners well know, that just requires the state to notify recipients of immunization requirements and all that, to notify them very clearly. Guess what? You have a right to exempt from this vaccine. Very simple, and passed substantially in the House and the Senate in the original session. We get to the veto override session, passes in the House. They needed 70. That's 2/3 in the House in the veto override session to override the governor's veto, and they got exactly 70.
And
So
Chris,
we're
just let me jump in right there, because this is one of my favorite things that happened the entire day. So I think Representative Edmonston was shocked that this bill passed. In fact, you recall there was a huge uproar in the gallery, because people were so thrilled to see that it had passed, and it just kind of felt emotionally like, oh, we got this. We're going to really make moves today. We're going to do something great. Well, in hindsight, we found out that the only reason it passed the House was because Representative Tammy Phelps, who said some really, really, I can't even say, just sacrilegious things on the House floor that day, accidentally voted for it. I can't even
Yes.
imagine how angry she was at herself to have lodged that vote.
Yes. So the reason why House Bill 399, a very straightforward piece of legislation that Kathy Edmonston had been working on for 3 years, the reason why it survived the governor's veto was because of the accidental vote of a liberal Democrat to give it 70 what it needed. But it got out. It got out, okay? And then it goes over to the Senate. It goes over to the Senate and it fails in the Senate. They needed 26 votes in the Senate and it got 23. And you want to know why it failed on the Senate side? It came 3 votes short of becoming law over the governor's veto because of 4 Republicans in the Senate, one of whom we just talked about a few minutes ago, Rogers Pope, the senator who endorsed Buddy Mincy out in Livingston, apparently does not think it's a good idea for Louisiana citizens to know clearly that they have a right to exempt from experimental vaccines in Louisiana. He voted against that. The notorious and infamous Republican Fred Mills voted against that.
What an
And
elitist vote, I have to say. Voting against this is just an elitist, look down your nose at the peasants vote.
absolutely. Louis Bernard out of Natchitoches Parish was there at the session, but where was he when this vote went down? Why
Yeah.
wasn't he in the chamber? Louis Bernard, the retiring senator out of Natchitoches Parish, and then our old friend Patrick Connick was also not in the room. Just was out. There is no excuse for senators not to be present to vote in a veto override session in legislation that's called in their chamber. So those 4 senators, 2 of whom, Pope and Mills, voted against this in the Senate, and 2 of whom were not absent. If 3 of those had voted in favor, this passes 26 votes in the Senate, and it becomes law in Louisiana over the governor's veto. Those 4 Republicans that is reprehensible. Absolutely. And to be honest with you, Danielle, I have more respect on some level, grudging respect for Pope and Mills, who at least had the courage to record a vote on it
Yeah.
rather than Bernard and Connick, who weren't even in the room and
Yeah.
didn't even register a vote.
Just cowered by the coffee table, I guess.
Yes.
And let's move on quickly, Chris, to House Bill 415. This is Representative Amity's CBDC bill. And maybe I'll just make one other point on this. So, just for the lay of the land to be very, very clear, we need 70 votes in the House for the bill to pass. We have 69 Republicans present. So for anything to pass, because Paula Davis and Joe Stagney are missing in action, we have to be joined by at least one Democrat in order to get any legislation through the House.
That's exactly correct. And that's very well said. So, House Bill 415, which you recall, Danielle, this is Representative Amity's central bank digital currency bill. Critical piece of legislation that Doss Heineman said was one of the top 2 or 3 of the whole session.
Yeah.
It's a bill that takes the first step in prohibiting CBDC in the state of Louisiana. And gets to the House on a veto override vote, fails by 1 vote, 69 to 28. 1 vote short of overriding the governor's veto in the House. How significant was Representative Paula Davis's, the Republican, and the Republican Joe Stagney's absence from this veto override session? If either one had been there and voted the way they should have voted, this passes in the House 70 to 28 and goes over to the Senate, failed by 1 vote, clearly and directly because of their absence at this veto override session.
It really turns my stomach, Chris, to think that here we are in a vulnerable position where the CBDC may be shoved down our throats, shoved into our bank accounts at any moment now, right? Like we have no guarantee that the government's not, I mean, all of our currency that's in the bank is digital right now anyway, right? And just to think that these 2 traitors to the state, frankly, could not show up for 6 hours to the Louisiana legislature to protect the people from the encroachment of the federal government is really beyond the pale to me.
It is beyond the pale, and that is why it is currently the presumption is not in their favor
No.
because of the very legitimate mistrust that they have earned by Louisiana citizens. So it's incumbent upon them to come forward and explain why they weren't there, and provide satisfactory justification. And we're going to stay on this until both of them do that because of what was at stake here and what almost occurred but didn't occur because of their absence. I will say this, Danielle, on 415, that no Republican who was present at the veto override session opposed the legislation. They all voted in favor of it. So again, this comes down directly to the absence of Paula Davis and
Yeah.
Joe Stagney at the override session.
It sure does. And that one, obviously, since it didn't pass the House, the Senate never saw it. So moving then to Representative Cruz's House Bill 658 was the next one that came up. That was the hospital pricing transparency bill.
Yes, very important bill that would allow patients and customers of hospitals and insurance providers to know exactly what they're being charged for different services. Just a very straightforward hospital transparency bill, pricing bill that was very, very important, gets called for the vote in the House in the veto override and fails 69-29, fails by one vote. As you know, it needed 70 and got 69. Every Republican who was present, Danielle, voted in favor, but once again, Representative Paula Davis and Representative Joe Stagney's absence. If either one of them had been at the veto override session and voted in favor, this legislation passes out of the House and onto the Senate with either a 70 or a 71 vote margin. Just so heartbreaking and so disappointing.
It's so unnecessary. And honestly, Chris, this one was a little bit of a head scratcher for me because it passed unanimously in the House in the regular session, and it passed overwhelmingly in the Senate, I believe, if not also unanimously. So the fact that this one came up short is just bizarre.
It is bizarre, but we have to remember, Danielle, that a lot can happen between a regular session and a veto override session. And don't think for one second that the governor was not laying his hands very, very heavily on those Democrats who actually supported this legislation in the regular session, and he just peeled them off one by one by one. So, with the Democrats he was able to peel off, coupled with the absence of Davis and Stagney, I don't know whether he had anything at all to do with their absence, but I guarantee you he may have. He may have had something to do with their absence, but these razor thin majorities that we have that just do not afford the luxury of Republicans not showing up for veto override sessions. It just and that's why we're bringing all this out.
Absolutely. The next bill that came up was Representative Cruz's House Bill 81. And you'll recall that this is the bill that just simply says that if a parent wants a child to be called by a pronoun or a name that's not on their birth certificate, they need to provide written consent to the school. Is that right, Chris?
Absolutely. That's basically what it said, and it was essentially an effort to stop this gender lunacy that's occurring in the schools, and to make sure that parents are made aware of what's occurring in the schools. Very important, very needed piece of legislation passed with substantial margins in the regular session, the House and the Senate. Governor vetoes. So we go into the veto override session, and this bill fails to override the governor's veto 67-29, fell 3 votes short. You know what is particularly disappointing to me about this, Danielle?
I do know, but you tell me.
5 Democrats who rarely, if ever, vote conservatively were so impressed with this legislation. 5 Democrats voted to override the governor's veto. Representative Pat Moore, Representative Adams, Representative Chad Brown, and Representative Cormier. Or maybe it was 4 because Melinda White is actually a Republican, right?
Yep.
So there was 4 Democrats who joined to vote in favor of the veto override. And you know why it failed, Danielle? Because there were 5 Republicans who were all there. I'm not talking about Davis or Stagney here. I'm talking about Republicans who were present for the veto override session, but voted against this veto override. Tanner McGee,
My representative.
Your representative, Representative Mary Dubuisson, Representative Richard Nelson, the Republican who's currently running for governor, Barbara Freiberg out of Baton Rouge, who has a very formidable opponent, thank God, for this October's reelection, and the infamous Stephanie Hilferty, the same one that went on national television on CNN and lambasted Representative Ray Garofalo for being a racist. Those five voted against this. If three of those five had voted in favor, this would have passed out of the House and it would have gone on to the Senate. I cannot believe that five Republicans caused this to fail in a veto override session, despite the help of four Democrats who saw it and wanted to get it through.
It's so disgusting to me, Chris, and I think it's just so arrogant. All I can say about this is these five Republicans, along with everybody else who voted against the bill, think that what? Public school teachers know better than parents how to treat and raise their children. That's what this is communicating to me, that they believe that parents don't deserve to have a say in how their child is called, how their child is spoken to, referred to, how their child is identified in school. That's disgusting.
It is disgusting, but I would say that their opposition to this was probably less philosophical and probably more political. How we would ever know what the uh, inner workings were, the communications between the governor and these representatives, perhaps other leaders, maybe Clay Schexnayder, with these individuals that caused them to vote against this legislation. I don't know, but I don't think it was philosophical. I think it was political. I think it was planned. But our listeners need to know the names of these Republicans who voted against this very important legislation and caused this veto override to fail. McGee, Dubuisson, Nelson, Freiberg, and Hilferty. And you know what, Danielle? Even though Stagney and Davis weren't present, we didn't even need those two rhinos to be present for this to pass. All we needed was for the Republicans who were there to make sure they voted for it. And the reason is because we got help from the Democrats. They still couldn't get it through.
Yeah. And you know what, Chris? I can see a political explanation, and I know you don't accept it. I certainly do not accept a political explanation. You know, when I was at the Capitol with you on Tuesday, I had not one, but two state representatives explain to me how complicated politics is and how, you can't really understand what all goes on behind the scenes. You can't possibly fathom all of the horse trading that goes on. You know what? At the end of the day, those two representatives do not answer. Well, I guess they do answer to whoever the person is that's calling the marching orders behind the scenes. But I'll tell you what, the people that they truly answer to are you and me, Chris, to all of our listeners. And frankly, I find it disgusting. And I also further find it disgusting because whether or not this was politically motivated, and I'm sure it was, it doesn't matter. What they're saying is, I would rather do what I need to do politically than to protect children, parents, and families of this state. And that deserves political retribution of the highest order.
Absolutely. And that is why all the calls to action are going to be down in the show notes for our listeners to have a field day on some of these folks. And I can't wait for it to happen.
Yeah, me either. Now, on to some good news. We're just going to shift gears completely and talk about something wonderful, something that shouldn't go uncelebrated by any stretch of the imagination, and that is Representative Furman's House Bill 648, Chris.
Yes, the prohibition on transgender surgery, mutilation, chemical castration of our minors. We are thrilled to report that this veto was overridden in both houses. In the House, it was overridden in a 76-23 vote. So every Republican who was present voted to override that veto, and also a number of Democrats joined, and they should be recognized as well. Representative Adams, the Democrat, Representative Brown, Representative Robbie Carter, Representative Travis Johnson, Representative Pat Moore, by whom I've been very impressed in a number of ways. I think in some ways she'd be a very good Republican. I think we need to work on that. Representative Dustin Miller, Democrat, and Representative Matt Cormier, who also I think could be a good Republican. Those Democrats joined 70 Republicans in the House to override the veto. And then over in the Senate, passed 28-11, with every Republican voting in favor. And also hats off to Senator Greg Tarver, the lone Democrat who joined the Republicans on the Senate floor in support of House Bill 648. I want to take a minute, Danielle, to talk about how important this is. This is the first time that any vetoed legislation was ever formally overturned in a veto override session. There were a couple of, back in 91 and 93, there were a couple of items that were overturned, vetoes that were overturned, but they were done within the regular session. This is the first time that any bill that was vetoed was overturned in a veto override session that was formally participated in. This is a very, very significant step in dismantling, slowly but surely, the imperial governorship that Chuck Owen so eloquently spoke about, and beginning to loosen the stranglehold that the governor has on legislative action in our state, going back many, many, many years. And quite frankly, Danielle, the silver lining on all these House votes that were called is that even calling those bills for a vote is significant. It's a significant movement in the right direction. And so I don't consider it's all bad news. As I said earlier, I think that the fact that those bills were voted on is a very, very good sign moving forward. But you're right, House Bill 648 passed overwhelmingly in both chambers, and now it is official that there will be no transgender genital mutilation procedures or chemical castration on minors in the state of Louisiana ever, not even one, under any circumstances. So do not come here. Louisiana will not be a sanctuary state for leftist lunacy.
Amen. And I saw a report this morning, I think, that Louisiana closed out the South in being the last state to ban this awful, awful practice, I guess we'll call it, because it's certainly not anything that deserves the term of, healthcare.
By the way, one of many reasons why I'm very proud to be a Southerner.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. A couple things to mention as well on this bill, Chris. One is, did you mention that Katrina Jackson joined the Republicans in the Senate?
She surely did.
She also did. And I also wanted to just mention, because we love to call the man out every time he does something, Fred Mills voted against this. Now, it's not a huge surprise. He tried to kill it when it came to his committee. He, in fact, did kill it when it came to his committee. But it certainly bears mentioning that he got up and gave a very impassioned, though completely wrong-headed and immoral speech about the bill, his opposition to the bill, and he certainly did cast his vote against it.
He did, Danielle. And if I said a few minutes ago that this vote was unanimous in the Senate, it is simply because I have psychologically eliminated Fred
Right.
Mills
Exactly.
entirely from my radar screen.
Well, why wouldn't
But
you?
why wouldn't I? I don't consider him a Republican, but
It's hard to even consider him a rhino, frankly.
it's hard to consider him a rhino because I do not like to insult rhinos.
I know you go out of your way to protect their delicate
Well,
sensitivities.
I don't like to insult them unfairly, and comparing Fred Mills to a rhino is an insult even to rhinos. So, absolutely no surprise there that Representative Mills was the only Republican in the Senate to oppose. As you said, it was academic because the Senate had more than enough votes to override that veto, and thank you, Lord, for it.
Yes, indeed. And I think we could have expected Joe Stagney to vote against it if he had the temerity to show up.
If Joe Stagney had had the temerity to show up, I believe that he would have done the right thing on this, what should be no brainer of an issue.
You think he would have?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Danielle. I would like to think that he would have. He voted against it in the regular session.
Yeah.
But I would like to think, in light of the fact that he's running for reelection now, and he knew that if he had, I think the reason why he didn't show up, probably one of the reasons was that he knew if he did, the pressure would have been overwhelming on him to vote for it. That's why I believe he had one of two choices. Either I'm going to show up and have to vote for this, or I'm not going to show up, and therefore I don't have to worry about voting for it. So if he had been there, I suspect he would have held his nose in a veto override session and probably voted for it.
Coward either way. Coward either way.
A coward either way, and his record vote in the regular session against this bill should be the end of his political career. By the way, Danielle, there is a fabulous young lady named Amanda Eberts who recently announced her candidacy for Joe Stagney's seat. So this is not going to be a walk-in for him. He is going to be in for the battle of his life, and I'm putting my money on Amanda Eberts over there in Jefferson Parish.
I love it. And she is just a young star. I think she's a firebrand. She's a fighter. I'm so excited to see her running, and I can't wait to see what heats up this election season, because I just think it's going to be very fun to watch, and I'm excited to get behind her.
A lot of good things coming down the line. She's going to do such a wonderful job as a leader. I mean, I can't say enough good about her. I didn't really know her very well until I saw her testify in the House Health and Welfare Committee in favor of Representative Furman's bill, this transgender minor bill. I was so impressed with her eloquence and her passion. And how articulate she was. You may have said this, Danielle, she's in her early 20s, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, she's in her early 20s, but let me tell you what, she is a rising star, and I'm so excited about being able to support her and help her in this election, not only because Joe Stagney is such a stain on the state legislature, but because she will be such a positive addition.
Yes, and I think it probably bears mentioning that she is a Turning Point USA. I don't know what her title is exactly, but ambassador or something like that. And hopefully, what she's doing is stirring up that passion in young high school students and college students, and really just being a force multiplier for our movement.
Oh, she is. That's Charlie Kirk's organization.
Yeah.
Superstar young conservative on the national stage who's done so much good. And I imagine he's probably pretty proud of Amanda Eberts.
I would imagine so. So, shifting gears, Representative Farnham's bill came up next. That was House Bill 646, which was the annual supplemental canvass to keep the voter rolls clean. We hadn't talked about this one in quite some time, but that one was sliced by the veto pen.
Yep, that was sliced by the veto pen, and we strongly supported this during the regular session. Passed substantially in both houses. Obviously, as you said, got spliced by Governor John Bel Edwards' red pen, and we go back into the veto override session. And heartbreakingly, Danielle fails to override the veto in a 69-30 vote. You know why this was so important, Danielle? Because I think there are 132,000, maybe 135,000 people still on our voter rolls, and that's probably very conservative throughout the state, who are either dead, have moved either out of their parish or out of state, yet are still on the voter rolls. That's got to be cleaned up. And in order to prevent that from happening in the future, this bill would have required an annual supplemental canvass of all registered voters in Louisiana to reduce fraud, to create more efficiency in the system. This is a no-brainer. Passes both houses in the regular session, and it fails by one vote in the House in a veto override session. Interestingly, Representative Neil Reiser was the only Republican to vote against it. I spoke to Representative Reiser about this, and he told me very directly, face to face, that that was an accident, that he did not intend to vote no on that legislation. I believe he tried to get it reconsidered, but because it was a no vote instead of just an absence, that was not possible to happen. But we have to say that because of Neil Rogers' no vote on that legislation, it failed by one vote.
Yeah, and I think it bears mentioning, Chris, as well, that Matt Cormier, the Democrat, voted with us on this one. So
As well as Representative Adams, a Democrat.
if Paula Davis or Joe Stagney would have shown up, this would have been this would have sailed absolutely right through.
Yes, if Paula Davis and Joe Stagney had been at the veto override session, if both of them had voted for this essential legislation, it passes the override 71 votes. And even if only one of them had done it, it would have gotten 70 votes and it would have gotten out of there. So once again, Representative Paula Davis's and Representative Joe Stagney's absence at the veto override session looms large.
Yeah, and I can't move on to the next one without just pointing out the obvious irony of an election integrity bill failing because of an incident with a machine.
You mentioned that in the show prep, Danielle, and I find that so interesting. Assuming Representative Reiser is being truthful, and I believe that he is, because when it comes to issues like this, he consistently votes the right way. I think he was sincere. I think he was heartfelt. So let's assume that this was a machine malfunction. What does that tell you, Danielle? And you brought this up and you get all the credit for it, about relying on machines to calculate reliably our votes throughout the state of Louisiana.
Well, I'll say that they're very fallible at best, and I think they're very easy to tamper with at worst. So I'm not willing to count on a machine, and I'm certainly not willing for a machine to try and count my vote. Clearly, this machine had issues. We'll hear a little bit more about machine issues later, even in today's episode. So I won't camp out on it right now, but certainly it's something that really, really, I'll say, heats me up. It's not acceptable. I think it's ridiculous. We count on machines because they're supposed to be more reliable. Well, they're clearly not.
And it was a machine malfunction that prevented a historic veto override by one vote of vitally important election integrity legislation. But hats off again, Danielle, as you said, to the Democrat Matt Cormier and also Representative Adams, who helped get this very close to passage, even though it failed.
Yes, indeed. A couple more to go. So the next one up was Representative Horton's House Bill 466. We have spent significant amount of time talking about this bill, which was the sexuality discussions in school being inappropriate and just prohibiting school personnel from broaching any of these sexuality, gender type topics with students during school hours.
And this one, Danielle, this veto override vote hurts. As you said, this is legislation simply would have prohibited inappropriate topics from being broached with minor public school students in school, made sure the parents are aware of it, would have made sure that students are not referred to by any pronoun other than what's on their biological birth certificate unless a parent is aware of it and authorizes it. Common sense, straightforward legislation passes by substantial margins in the regular session in both the House and the Senate. We go in for the veto override session and fails by 2 votes. It gets 68 votes. It needed 70. And it failed despite the several Democrats joining in support of the legislation. Representative Adams, Representative Chad Brown, Representative Matt Cormier, Representative Patton Moore, all Democrats who joined in to try to get this through in a veto override. And it failed because of the votes of several Republicans. Would you like, Danielle, to regale our audience with the names of the Republicans who caused this to fail?
It would be my pleasure. Barbara Freiberg, no surprise. Stephanie Hilferty, also no surprise. Mary Dubuisson, Richard Nelson. And I'll also just mention that my state representative, Tanner McGee, walked out on the vote. Now, he did vote against it the first time, but he I guess he didn't want to vote against it this time, so he just opted to leave the room.
Yeah, so the way I characterize this, Tanner McGee in voting against this good legislation in the regular session, and then in just walking out and not voting at all in an override, it appears that Representative McGee lacked the courage of his formerly misplaced convictions.
Yeah, that's well said. I can't even add to it.
So that's what did it.
Yeah.
So if even two of those Republicans whom you named had done the right thing and voted the right way, 466 overrides the governor's veto in the House and goes on to the Senate. What a heartbreaker.
It was a total heartbreaker, and Representative Horton worked so hard on that. So many worked so hard on that, and to see it die like this is just, I mean, it's another political stunt that we don't have time for. That's how I feel about it.
Yes, Danielle. And it's important to know that on so much of this legislation, they didn't just work hard on it this year.
Yeah.
Some of this legislation they've been working hard on for 2 years and 3 years to get it to the finish line. That's what makes it so disappointing when you
Yeah.
think about how hard they worked on this. And by the way, Danielle, on this one, we didn't even need atrocious Joe Stagney and Paula Davis there for this, even though they were absent. We had the
Yeah.
votes by the Republicans who were there and couldn't get it through.
Couldn't get it through. And I think yet again, we're looking at the political machine superseding the not just the will of the people, but the best interest of the children. And that's what's really disgusting about all of this.
That is what's disgusting, but I'll tell you, Danielle, the great silver lining in all of this, and again, grudging respect to Clay Scheck-Snyder, because he allowed it to happen.
It's
We
on the
have
record, huh?
recorded, it's on the record. We have
You're so right.
recorded votes. Beryl Amade, or one of the representatives, told us recently that they hate having to record their votes on things that they know they should be for, but want to vote against, or should be against, but feel like they have to vote for. You know what they want to do? They don't want to have a vote on things like that at all, but they had to vote. He forced the vote on it. Credit to him again. So it's all on record now. They can't run and hide. They can't go away. And believe me, it's going to be great fodder and great ammunition for all of these races coming up in the fall. And I'm so excited to knock some of these rhinos out of their saddles.
Yeah. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, although it's really hard to gloat about the loss, but we can take the silver lining and do with it what we can salvage from it, we're certainly going to use.
Yes. Danielle,
So,
you realize that before we move on, I know you want to talk about specifically about a couple of elections that are coming up in October that we want to call our listeners' attention to. But I wanted to let the listeners know also that you realize that, and this is something that we have to give our listeners and our CAG members great credit for. The state Senate and the House, 2 or 3 weeks before this override session, they had basically decided that the only thing they wanted to go in there and vote on, I'm talking about the corrupt leadership, the only
yeah.
things that they wanted was House Bill 648, Gabe Ferment's transgender on minors bill. They had basically made that decision. And then our listeners and citizens across Louisiana started amping up the pressure on them unbelievably. And that is the only reason why we have these recorded votes, why so many of these bills were actually called for an up and down vote. So that is great credit to our listeners, to the State of Freedom folks, to LeCag, and to other citizens in Louisiana, that we have these recorded votes that we can now use against these rhinos. What a gift our listeners have given us.
Yes, indeed. And I think your point too, Chris, about this really breaking the back of the imperial governorship. And it's kind of like that whenever the 4 Minute Mile barrier was broken by the first runner, and then suddenly all of these other people started breaking the barrier and just having quicker and quicker times that just boggled the mind. The same thing can be said of this. I'm thinking about this in the same exact way when it comes to the governor and his power, his assumed power versus his actual power. Once people stand up against him and it's proven that it can be done, and guess what? Everybody still lives. We can move on and fight another day, and people are going to, the groundswell is going to be more and more and more. I think courage begets courage, so this is what we are looking at. I think that's absolutely a huge, huge piece of this that can't be understated, but also kind of goes unsaid because it is that kind of quiet, unseen aspect of the override session. So I just really want to make it clear that we believe that this is a first step of many to just making sure that the people's voices are heard much, much louder than the governor's.
Absolutely. The dam has been broken. There is a chink in the armor. We know now that it is possible to override a governor's veto in the state of Louisiana in a veto override session and live to see another day.
Probably wasn't always the case. It probably, I mean,
Probably was not
not to be
always the
light
case.
about it, but it probably was not always the case.
It was not always the case. So what a historic precedent that has been set. And it's just unfortunate that what should be a unqualified celebration, to some
Yeah,
degree, there's a shadow over it because of all of the missed opportunities that we had. And it's our responsibility to make sure that the people who caused those missed opportunities are exposed consistently so that they can be removed from office and replaced by constitutional conservatives who know how to get the ball into the end zone for the citizens of Louisiana. And that's what we will have.
absolutely. And have the courage to do it, right?
And have the courage to do it. As you said a minute ago, Danielle, courage begets courage. I'm going to remember that phrase.
Well, we just have a couple bills left to cover, and then we can kind of shift into some of the races that are coming up. So the next one that came up on the House floor was Representative Eccles' House Bill 125. This wasn't one that we spent a lot of time on, if we talked about at all on the podcast, but it prohibited the ownership of land for foreign adversaries, I think. And Chris, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand, it strengthened and brought some financial and legal recourse specific to landowners when it comes to foreign adversaries.
That's exactly right. And this legislation mainly had to do with agricultural land, and you could make a strong argument that the subject matter of this bill was covered in Representative Hodges' House Bill 537, which was actually signed by the governor. But nonetheless, this was a good piece of legislation. House Bill 125 passed in the House and the Senate, obviously in the regular session, vetoed by the governor, goes into the override session, passed out of the House in an override session in a 72-25 vote, with every Republican voting in favor, and then goes over to the Senate, where they had the opportunity to etch this into law over the governor's veto. And because of names with whom our listeners have now become very familiar, it failed in the Senate by 3 votes. It needed 26, it got 23. Representative Rogers Pope couldn't bring himself to vote in favor of this important legislation to keep our foreign enemies from buying up our agricultural land in the state of Louisiana. He thought it was a bad idea to vote for that. He voted against it. Representative Fred Mills votes against it. And then Louis Bernard, the state senator retiring from up in Natchitoches, and Patrick Connick from over in Plaquemines Parish both voted against it. 2 noes and 2 Republican absent for the vote, fails 23-15. What an absolute unbelievable fact and set of events there.
It is. And I think the culture of the House being so different from the culture of the Senate can be seen quite easily here. Look, we also had Representative Roy Adams, Matt Cormier, and Pat Moore joined the Republicans to pass this in the House. So it passed with Democratic support in the House, whereas in the Senate, Republicans not only peeled off, but they completely killed the bill.
Completely killed the bill. So, where was Representative Louis Bernard? Where was
And
Representative Patrick Connick? What were
yeah,
they doing? What were they doing that was so important that they couldn't be in the Senate chamber to vote for this override? Where were they? Were they out in the parking lot? Did they fall out of the window? Did they fall down the stairs?
you know what, Chris? I'll tell you that they did not fall out of the window because they surely were present to vote to adjourn.
Yes. So they managed to make their way back into the Senate chamber to vote to adjourn so they could leave so they didn't miss their cocktail hour.
That's right.
That's what it was. So they must not have fallen out of the window. So they were there somewhere, but apparently they had more important things going on than to vote to override the veto of legislation that would prevent our foreign enemies from buying up our agricultural land. Shame on you, Louis Bernard. Shame on you, Patrick Connick, for not being in there. And shame on you, Rogers Pope and Fred Mills, for casting a no vote on this legislation and costing us this override in the Senate.
Yep. And I won't miss the opportunity just to also add shame to Joe Stagney and Paula Davis because, I mean, why not say it 85 times in one episode?
Well, the only reason why we didn't mention their absence within the context of HB 125 is because it passed out of there even without their presence. But we're not excusing it. It just hurts a little bit more when you look at a piece of legislation that very well would have gotten through if they had been there. And this wasn't one of them, fortunately.
Yes, indeed. So the last piece of legislation that was taken up was Representative Edmonston's House Bill 182, which our members are very, very familiar with. This was the bill that would make it so no student in the state of Louisiana could face a mandate related to the COVID shot.
That's exactly right. Passed substantially both houses in the regular session, vetoed by the governor. This very important piece of legislation that once and for all finally statutorily establishes in the state of Louisiana very clearly that no public or private school can ever again mandate the COVID shot. We go into a veto override session and it fails on the House floor by one vote. This is one that hurts because of Stagney and Davis's absence. Because every Republican who was there, Danielle, voted in favor. Every one of them was there. They all voted. There were nobody who didn't vote. All voted, but it failed by one vote. Davis and Stagney's absence.
Not exactly. So this one
Oh,
was,
Farnham. I didn't even
yes,
see it.
Representative Farnham.
Farnham was absent.
Yes, this was another quote unquote machine malfunction.
Uh,
And actually, we did have a Democrat, Matt Cormier, who joined us.
I just had a notepad malfunction and I didn't see Farnham's name down there. But Danielle, that's so important. I'm so glad that you brought that up because this is another thing that implicates the unreliability of machines. Representative Farnham was absent for this vote in the House. If he would have voted. What exactly happened there? Because I think he wanted to vote for it. Is that what happened?
What I heard from, I believe, Representative Edmonston was retelling the story at the end of the day, and it was that Representative Farnham's vote did not get registered by the machine, and so there was some back and forth, but he could not get his vote registered because there's a rule in the House that you can't add your vote back at the end if it's going to make the difference in the outcome of the vote. So there was some talk in the House that they were going to bring the bill forward again and have it reheard because there was a problem with the machine. However, the Senate in the meantime voted unanimously to adjourn. Now, they could have done something, right? They could have asked the House, for instance, hey guys, are y'all done over there? Are you closing up for the day? They did none of that. What they did was they just closed up shop, voted to go home, and went directly to cocktail hour. So that left Representative Edmonston's House Bill 182 hanging in the balance. Well, it just, I mean, I guess not hanging in the balance. It left it hanging and dead. And it also left one other one. What was the other bill? The one with Neil Reiser. That was Representative Farnham's 646, the supplemental canvas. Same story. They could have brought that again because of the machine malfunction. However, they were unable to do so because the Senate had adjourned. So there was no Senate to take up the bill should these successfully pass the House. There was no one to greet them in the Senate.
That's right. And Representative Edmonston on 182 and Representative Neil Reiser on 646. Neil Reiser said to me it was a mistaken vote, machine malfunction, whatever it was. I'm going to ask for a revote on it. I believe he was going to do that or actually did that. Same with 182 and Farnham's machine malfunction. But what's the point, Danielle? As you said, what's the point of going forward with that when the Senate is over there rushing to get to cocktail hour and adjourning? So what's the point of recalling it, knowing it's got to go to the Senate and be passed there as well, where there's nobody in the Senate? They've headed for the bars and they've turned the lights off. So what's the
Yeah.
point of continuing in the House?
Yeah, exactly. It was such a shame to see that. And it just feels like, I mean, on one hand, you kind of feel like, oh, people need to be more diligent. They could have done something different. On the other hand, it just really feels orchestrated, Chris. I hate to say it.
It does feel orchestrated when you look at this from a little bit. When you take the long view at all of this, there's no way that some of this at least was not by design, and I believe it was calculated to protect those who are in an election season, who are having to run for reelection, while making sure that what they wanted to failed nonetheless. By the way, Danielle, on House Bill 182, thank you for correcting me on Farnham on that bill. But you realize that even if you take Farnham out of the equation and say, okay, he didn't vote on it, and let's say it failed 69-28. If Stagney and Davis had been at the veto session and even one of them had voted in favor, that's 70 votes, passes, and goes on to the Senate. So once again, Davis and Stagney's absence from this veto override session looms large across the plain.
Yes, indeed. They just killed our margin of error, right? And clearly there's been some error, whether it was error or purposeful, meddling. I don't know if we'll ever know the answer to that, but
Well, the presumption is not in their favor, and
no,
they are
it's not.
both up for reelection in the fall. So it behooves them to make darn sure that they provide satisfactory justification for their absence.
It certainly does. And we would encourage our listeners to express your displeasure with their votes by giving them a call or emailing them. And I also just want to say that this is a great opportunity that you can support good candidates who are running against any of these traitors of the state. Yeah, absolutely. So if they don't have opponents yet, I think the deadline to file to run for state office is August 8th. So please do your level best and find someone to run for their seat. If you know people in that area, please drum up support and try and find good people to run. We need them. I would say that these folks that we underscored, that you heard their names over and over again in a negative way, they are weak and vulnerable, not just morally, but also politically.
Yes, they don't want you to know that they're weak and vulnerable politically, but believe me, they are. And if they weren't, and I can tell you, they're even more vulnerable after this veto override session than they were before, and they were vulnerable before. But Danielle, let's talk a little bit about couple of the important races where very good opposition candidates have announced their intention to run.
Yes, indeed. So the first one I have on my list is Louis Bernard. He is not seeking reelection, but there's someone really great running for his seat.
Yes, this is Senate District 31, right, Danielle, up in Natchitoches, Rapides, Wind Parish, that area, Red River Parish, Wind Parish, and Representative Alan Seabaugh is running to fill the retiring Louis Bernard's Senate seat.
He's so
Cannot
great.
say, oh, he is. Cannot say enough good about Representative Alan Seabaugh. Consistent constitutional conservative. The Senate needs Representative Alan Seabaugh.
Yes, it certainly does. And just as a reminder to the listeners, I believe it was Representative Seabaugh who made the most epic mic drop moment of the entire session happen whenever he said that Fred Mills's bill identified his amendment to Fred Mills' bill identified as germane.
What a classic epic moment. Katie put together the little video on that. And I have to tell you, there's something to be said for rounding out a coup de shot shot across the bow, having a little Snoop Dogg at the end of that.
I love that. I love that video. The next one is Fred Mills, Senator Fred Mills, the infamous. We love to not trust him. He is termed out, but Representative Blake Maguez is running for his seat.
Running a great race over there. Blake Maguez has been on our show, and you recall that Blake Maguez is the one who brought House Bill 311, the
Yeah.
constitutional amendment that will appear on the ballot in October that will ban all the dark illicit money from our election system in Louisiana. One of the most important pieces of legislation in the session. Blake Maguez is a great, great conservative, and he hopefully will be elected to fill Fred Mills' state Senate seat over in New Iberia, I believe, and covers maybe part of Lafayette as well. And I can't think of any greater polar opposites than Fred Mills and Blake Maguez.
It would be such a win for us to have him. So please support him. We will have for the people who are running for office that we know on the, as opponents to these folks, we will have their links insofar as they have links yet in the show notes. So if there's a way for you to support them financially, please just go and click on their site and throw them a few dollars so that they can run an effective campaign. The next person up is my state representative, Tanner McGee. We heard on Tuesday that he is not seeking reelection. There's a few people locally who have come out, Chris, and said that they would be running for his seat, but I think we may still be in need of a strong, strong conservative for the area. This is Homa. This is District 53 down here. So if anyone listening knows of someone great, please, please let us know. We would be happy
Yes.
to pass things along.
Tanner McGee, Danielle, has been a menace in the legislature. He has by no means been a consistent conservative, and more often than not, when he's had an opportunity to make decisions that truly reflect fidelity to the interests of his constituents, he has chosen to enrich his friends or enrich himself. It's sad, but it is true. And it is very, very important that that seat be filled by a true conservative. I also want to say this about Tanner McGee. I know that our listeners and the CAG members and other Louisiana citizens have been hammering him, not striking below the belt, not doing anything overly personal, but hammering him on his record and specifically the way he handled the budget debacle in the last hour or two of the 2023 session. What a disgrace. What a disaster. And I can guarantee you that a lot of the reason why he's not running for reelection, why he's decided not to run, is because of the pressure and the hits that he's been taking. And God bless our listeners and citizens across this state for doing that. And I'll tell you another thing that didn't help him, that we've criticized him about relentlessly, is the idea that he would call in to Dodie Horton's district up in North Louisiana in Bossier, 5.5 or 6 hours away from where he lives, just to bash her.
Yeah.
Because she had the courage to stand up for fiscal discipline in the legislative session. I thought that was reprehensible. We hammered him on that. And we had Dodie Horton on our show, and she talked about that. All of these factors coalescing, I think, resulted in his decision not to run for reelection because he doesn't want the heat anymore. But now we have a situation where we've got to get him replaced by someone who's reliably conservative. Otherwise, we haven't finished the deal.
Indeed. And Chris, you've already mentioned that Joe Stagney has a fantastic opponent. That's Amanda Ebert. We'll also have her link in the show notes. Two others to mention, I think, Chris. One is Patrick Connick, Senator Patrick Connick, who, was not super happy to be there and didn't show up for every single vote this veto override session. As of now, it does not appear that he has an opponent. He's also not yet registered to seek reelection, but we believe that he is seeking reelection. And we
Correct.
have,
And he's over in Jefferson and in Plaquemines Parish.
okay. And then
So he needs an opponent.
the same is for Paula Davis, right? She also needs an opponent, and we have every reason to believe she will run again.
Exactly correct. I want to mention, and I want to make sure, I know you'll make sure that we get all these races in here, Danielle, but I have to mention one of my favorite candidates who's announced is Jenny Seals, who is announced to run against the notorious, infamous rhino Barbara Freiberg.
Oh my word. That's exciting.
That is exciting. She's been a thorn in our side for way too long. It's time for her to go. Jenny Seals is so impressive. She's announced to run against Barbara Freiberg. I believe she's going to win, and she's got great energy, great enthusiasm. So please make sure that if you have an opportunity to contribute, to donate in any way you can to Jenny Seals, to do so.
Amazing. Yes, we will include all of these links in the show notes. So if there's someone you want to support financially or by volunteering or by an encouraging email or however, you will be able to do so. Any final words, Chris?
Well, I would be remiss if I did not mention the race out in Livingston Parish to fill, and maybe we did mention it, but I'm going to mention it again, to fill Rogers Pope Senate seat. Valerie Hodges, the state rep, is running against Buddy Mincy out there. Valerie Hodges brought House Bill 537 to protect our land against our foreign enemies. She's done so many other good things in the legislature. She has stood so strong, while Buddy Mincy has enriched his friends, has gotten in bed with the school boards, the teachers' unions, tried to get us entered into this multi-state compact under the supervision and direction of the federal government. He's been a disaster. He's been a rhino. Please support Valerie Hodges to fill, and most importantly, Rogers Pope has endorsed Buddy Mincy to fill his Senate seat. If you knew nothing else, that should be enough to tell you that you don't need to be voting for Buddy Mincy.
There you go. Exactly. I think we have a lot of candidates to be excited about, a lot of people to support. I think LeCag is going to be involved in quite a number of races. We still have to sit down. That's our next homework, Chris. We have to sit down and go through all of these races and figure out where we're going to be lending support. But I
Yes,
think
and let me
there's,
say this, Daniel. Let me say this. If our listeners will do this, it is so important that we continue to broaden our State of Freedom platform.
yes,
So I want to prayerfully encourage all of our listeners to please continue to subscribe and share and listen to the State of Freedom, because the more people who get the information, the more broadly it's disseminated, the more powerful it's going to be. We will always tell you the truth. You can always trust us to tell you the truth. We will always get it to you, but the truth has to be spread. It has to be spread broadly and widely, and we count on you to help us to do that.
yes, absolutely. And what a tremendous spreading has already taken place. We just can't thank you enough for your consistent listenership, your support, your prayers. Honestly, Chris, I think I'd mentioned this to you yesterday when we spoke, but going to the Capitol, I haven't been able to get down there very much, or up there, from way down the bayou, but I haven't been able to get there very much just because it's such a far drive for me. And what a reception. I mean, people have just been so kind, saying that they love the show, that it encourages them, it empowers them to action. And that's exactly what, when you and I started, we didn't know what we were doing. And some days we still don't. But I would say that if we had some goals in mind, it was certainly that we wanted to be light, we wanted to be positive, we wanted to be truthful, and we wanted to empower people to action. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing. And it's just so encouraging to hear that that is the way that people are experiencing our show.
Absolutely, Danielle, that's exactly right. And you want to talk about someone who's encouraged us and also does so much good in his own right as a member of a convention of states. Just getting information out there is J.C. Harmon. What an asset he is to the community in just making sure that people get good information. I have a lot of respect for J.C. Harmon. But Danielle, I tell you what, I feel like I could sit here and talk to you for another 2 or 3 or 4 hours. I enjoy it so much. It's the time just flies by when you're having fun.
We always
Um,
have fun.
we always have fun, and we're going to continue to have fun. And together with all of our listeners and by God's holy grace, each day we will move forward to preserve the state of freedom in Louisiana.
Amen.
Thanks for listening to The State of Freedom. To stay on top of all the calls to action we mentioned today, just check out the show notes for the episode. To get involved with Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, visit lacag.org, LACAG.org, or email Chris at chris@lacag.org. If you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe and share it. Give us a good rating in the reviews. If you own a business in Louisiana and are interested in supporting our show through advertising, please email us at ads.freedomstate@gmail.com. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you next time.